Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? The old man behind the counter asked the question softly, but Angela Brooks felt it hit harder than any bill she had opened that month. For a moment, she just stared at the gold wedding ring resting on the glass display case between them. It looked so small, so ordinary, yet it was the most valuable thing she had left in the world. Outside, rain tapped against the pawn shop window as people hurried past without noticing the woman standing inside, fighting back tears. Angela swallowed hard and nodded. I don't have a choice. Arthur Whitman, the 68-year-old owner of Whitman Pawn and Loan, looked down at the ring again. His weathered hands carefully turned it beneath the overhead light. He had bought and sold thousands of items during the last 40 years. Watches, necklaces, family heirlooms, military medals. But something about this ring made him pause. I can give you $12, he finally said. Angela closed her eyes for a second. $12. Her wedding ring. $12. The ring her husband Marcus had slipped onto her finger 11 years earlier. The ring she had promised herself she would never sell. But promises didn't fill empty stomachs. She forced herself to smile. I'll take it. Arthur looked at her again, studying the exhaustion beneath her eyes. The faded coat, the worn sneakers, the quiet dignity she was trying desperately to hold together. Most people argued when they heard an offer that low. Angela didn't. She simply signed the paperwork with trembling fingers. Arthur slid 3 $5 bills toward her, then quietly took one back. 12, he said. Angela nodded and folded the money into her purse. Every dollar already had a purpose. Bread, milk, peanut butter, maybe a box of macaroni if prices hadn't gone up again. As she turned toward the door, her phone buzzed. A text message appeared on the cracked screen. It was from her 10-year-old son, Mason. Mom, is there food coming home tonight? Angela stopped walking. Her chest tightened instantly. She stared at the message for several seconds before typing back. Yes, baby. I'm on my way. A second message arrived almost immediately. Ava says she's not hungry anymore. Angela knew what that meant. Her 7-year-old daughter always said she wasn't hungry whenever there wasn't enough food for everyone. She was trying to save whatever remained for her brother. Angela quickly wiped her eyes before the tears could fall. Everything okay? Arthur asked. She forced another smile. Just my kids. Then she walked out into the rain. Arthur watched through the window as she hurried across the parking lot and climbed into an aging sedan that looked one bad day away from quitting forever. He expected himself to move on to the next customer. Instead, his eyes drifted back to the ring sitting alone on the counter. Something about it bothered him. Something he couldn't explain. For a long moment, he simply stared at it while rain rolled down the glass outside. Then he reached for the ring one more time. As he slowly turned it over beneath the light, his expression changed. The slightest flicker crossed his face. Confusion, recognition, maybe even shock. Whatever he had just noticed, it was enough to make him sit down heavily in his chair. Outside, Angela drove toward the grocery store with $12 and a prayer. Inside the pawn shop, Arthur Whitman continued staring at the wedding ring, unable to look away. And for the first time in many years, he quietly canceled the rest of his afternoon appointments. The grocery store was nearly empty by the time Angela pushed her cart through the automatic doors. She held the $12 so tightly in her hand that the bills had become wrinkled. Every step felt calculated. Every price tag felt personal. She moved slowly past shelves filled with things other families bought without thinking. Cereal boxes, frozen dinners, fresh fruit, items that had quietly become luxuries in her world. She stopped in front of the bread aisle and checked the prices twice before placing the cheapest loaf into her cart. Next came a gallon of milk, then a jar of peanut butter. She stared at a box of macaroni and cheese for several seconds before finally adding it too. The total in her head climbed dangerously close to her limit. At the checkout lane, Angela held her breath as the cashier scanned each item. The register displayed $11.63. Relief washed over her, so suddenly she almost laughed. She paid and carried the single grocery bag like it contained treasure. 20 minutes later, her aging sedan pulled into the parking lot of Cedar Grove Apartments. The building looked tired. Peeling paint clung to the walls. Several windows were covered with cardboard. The broken security light near the entrance had not worked for months. Angela climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor carrying the groceries. Before she even reached her door, it opened. Mason appeared first. His eyes immediately locked onto the bag. Behind him stood Ava, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one missing ear. Neither child asked what was inside. They simply smiled. That hurt Angela more than any complaint ever could. Children should not have to be grateful for bread and peanut butter. "Mom is home," Mason announced proudly as if she had returned from some heroic journey. Angela stepped inside their small apartment. The air conditioner had stopped working weeks ago. The furniture was old. The refrigerator hummed loudly in the corner. Yet the moment Ava wrapped her arms around her waist, it felt like the safest place in the world. "Guess what?" Ava said. "I saved half my crackers from lunch." Angela forced a smile. "You did not have to do that, sweetheart." "I wanted to." Angela turned away before her daughter could see her eyes filling again. 30 minutes later, the three of them sat around the tiny kitchen table eating peanut butter sandwiches and sharing glasses of milk. Mason talked about school. Ava talked about a drawing she wanted to finish. For a few precious minutes, everything felt normal. Then there was a knock at the door. Angela froze. Her smile disappeared instantly. She already knew who it was. Nobody else knocked that way. 3 sharp taps. A pause. Then 2 more. The landlord. Mason noticed the change in her face. "Mom." Angela stood slowly and walked toward the door. Slipped beneath it was a folded piece of paper. She picked it up before opening the door. By the time she unfolded the notice, the footsteps were already moving down the hallway. Her stomach dropped. "Rent overdue. Final warning. Payment required within 14 days. Angela lowered the paper and looked back toward her children, who were still finishing their sandwiches, completely unaware of how close they were to losing the only home they had. Across town, Arthur Whitman sat alone in his pawn shop long after closing time. The wedding ring remained on his desk beneath a small lamp. He had examined it 6 times already. Each time he became more certain that what he had discovered was real. And each time, the question haunting him only grew stronger. Who exactly was Angela Brooks? The next morning, Arthur Whitman unlocked his pawn shop 2 hours earlier than usual. He had barely slept. The wedding ring sat exactly where he had left it, resting on a folded cloth beneath the desk lamp. Sunlight filtered through the front window as he picked it up again and examined the tiny inscription hidden inside the band. Most people would never have noticed it. The engraving was worn from years of use, almost invisible unless the light struck it at exactly the right angle. Arthur read the words again. Then he opened an old filing cabinet in the back office and began searching through records that had not been touched in decades. Across town, Angela woke before sunrise. She sat at the edge of her bed staring at the rent notice in her hands. 14 days. That was all the time she had left. She quietly folded the paper before Mason and Ava could see it. The children were still asleep in the next room. For a few seconds she allowed herself to imagine what would happen if she could not pay. The thought alone made her chest tighten. She pushed it away and focused on what she could control. Breakfast, school, work, one day at a time. That had become her entire survival strategy. By 7:30, Mason and Ava were sitting at the small kitchen table eating toast. Ava carefully broke her piece in half and offered part of it to her mother. "You forgot your breakfast again," she said. Angela smiled. "I am not hungry yet." Mason looked up from his plate. "Mom, when I get older, I am going to buy you a huge house." Angela laughed. Softly. "A huge house. The biggest one in the neighborhood. What about me?" Ava asked. "You can live there too," Mason replied. "But you have to help pay for snacks." For the first time in days, all 3 of them laughed together. The sound lingered in the apartment long after they left for school. Meanwhile, Arthur continued digging through old records. Dust coated his fingertips. Yellowed folders filled the desk around him. Finally, he found what he had been looking for. A newspaper clipping folded inside a faded envelope. The photograph showed 3 young men standing together outside a manufacturing plant nearly 30 years earlier. Arthur stared at one face in particular. His expression slowly changed. There it was. The same last name. The same connection he had suspected. He leaned back in his chair, stunned. "It cannot be," he whispered. Yet the evidence sat directly in front of him. That afternoon, Angela reported to her second job cleaning offices downtown. The building was nearly empty. Most employees had already gone home. She vacuumed hallways, emptied trash bins, and wiped down conference tables while quietly calculating bills in her head. Rent, utilities, school supplies. Every number felt impossible. Around 8 o'clock, her supervisor approached carrying a clipboard. "Angela, Can I talk to you for a minute? Her stomach dropped instantly. She knew that tone. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Budget cuts, reduced hours, company restructuring. The words blurred together. When it was over, she would be working 10 fewer hours each week. 10 hours she desperately needed. Angela nodded politely, thanked her supervisor, and walked back to her cleaning cart. Only when she was alone did she allow herself to close her eyes. At nearly the same moment, Arthur Whitman locked his office door and picked up the phone. He dialed a number from the newspaper clipping. It rang twice before an elderly voice answered. Arthur tightened his grip on the receiver. I need to ask you about someone, he said quietly. A man named Marcus Brooks. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then the voice on the other end spoke words Arthur never expected to hear. After all these years, the man whispered, someone finally found the ring. Arthur Whitman remained seated long after the phone call ended. The silence inside the pawn shop felt different now, heavier somehow. He slowly lowered the receiver and looked once more at the wedding ring resting on his desk. For 90 days he had legally owned it. Yet suddenly it felt as though it belonged to a story much larger than a simple pawn transaction. The elderly man on the phone had known Marcus Brooks. Not casually, not distantly. The emotion in his voice had made that clear. Arthur glanced at the newspaper clipping again. 30 years ago, 3 young men had stood smiling in front of a small manufacturing company that no longer existed. One of them had been Marcus. Another was the man Arthur had just spoken to. And according to everything he had learned during the past 24 hours, there was a missing chapter nobody had talked about in decades. The following morning, Angela sat at her kitchen table, studying her budget. The numbers refused to cooperate. Reduced hours meant a smaller paycheck. A smaller paycheck meant impossible choices. She crossed out one expense after another until there was almost nothing left. Mason walked into the kitchen wearing his school backpack. Mom, are you coming to career day next month? Angela forced a smile. Of course I am. Promise. I promise. Mason nodded, satisfied. He had no idea that Angela was wondering whether she would still have the apartment by then. After the children left for school, she opened her email hoping for good news. Instead, she found another rejection. Thank you for applying. We have decided to move forward with other candidates. Angela closed the laptop. That made 7 applications and 7 rejections. She rubbed her temples and stared out the window. Across the parking lot, a moving truck was parked outside another apartment. A family was leaving. The sight sent a chill through her. She wondered how many days remained before she might be doing the same thing. Meanwhile, Arthur drove nearly 70 miles to a neighboring town. The road wound through quiet farmland before leading him to a modest white house surrounded by oak trees. An elderly man named Walter Henderson answered the door. His hair was silver now, but Arthur immediately recognized him from the newspaper photograph. Walter invited him inside. For nearly 2 hours they talked. Arthur listened far more than he spoke. Every answer seemed to create even bigger questions. Marcus Brooks had apparently helped build something remarkable years earlier, something that had changed multiple lives. Yet his name had almost vanished from the story. Walter finally looked toward the wedding ring lying on the coffee table. His eyes softened. Marcus never cared about credit, he said quietly. That was always his weakness. He spent more time helping other people than helping himself. Arthur leaned forward. Then why did his family end up struggling? Walter sighed deeply. That is exactly what I have been trying to understand. Back in Cedar Grove Apartments, Angela arrived home carrying groceries from a food pantry. The boxes were small, but she was grateful for every item. As she climbed the stairs, she noticed an official envelope taped to her door. Her pulse quickened immediately. She pulled it free and stared at the bold lettering on the front. For several seconds, she could not bring herself to open it. Because deep down, she already feared she knew what it might say. Angela stood motionless in the hallway, staring at the envelope while neighbors passed by without noticing the storm unfolding inside her chest. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Finally, she carried it into the apartment and closed the door behind her. Mason and Ava were in the living room working on homework. Neither child noticed her trembling hands. Angela slipped into the kitchen and carefully opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the first line, then the second. The color drained from her face. It was not an eviction notice yet, but it was the final legal warning before one. Unless the overdue balance was paid within 10 days, formal proceedings would begin. 10 days. Angela lowered herself into a chair. She had expected bad news. She had not expected the clock to move this fast. For several minutes she sat, quietly staring at the paper. Then she folded it neatly and placed it inside a drawer. The children did not need to carry that burden. Not yet. That evening, Mason walked into the kitchen holding a school flyer. "Mom, there is a field trip next month." Angela smiled. "That sounds fun. It costs $20. The smile remained on her face, but something behind her eyes changed. $20 might as well have been $2,000. Mason immediately noticed. "It is okay if I cannot go." Angela reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We will figure something out." He nodded, pretending to believe her. Later that night, after both children were asleep, Angela sat alone with her laptop searching for more jobs. She applied for cashier positions, receptionist positions, warehouse positions, anything she could find. One application after another. Midnight came and went. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Eventually, exhaustion forced her to close the computer. Before heading to bed, she opened an old wooden box stored in the closet. Inside were photographs of Marcus. Family pictures, birthday pictures, vacation pictures from years when life had seemed manageable. Angela picked up one photo and traced his smile with her finger. "I could really use your help right now," she whispered. Across town, Arthur Whitman sat in a small diner across from Walter Henderson. A stack of old documents rested between them. Some were business records. Others were newspaper articles. Piece by piece, a forgotten story was beginning to emerge. Walter removed a faded photograph from an envelope and slid it across the table. Arthur studied it carefully. The image showed a much younger Marcus standing beside several employees inside a manufacturing plant. Everyone in the picture looked proud, hopeful. "Nobody talks about what happened afterward," Walter said quietly. "Most people do not even know his role anymore." Arthur looked up. "Why?" Walter stared through the diner window for several seconds before answering. "Because Marcus walked away from something that could have made him very wealthy." Arthur frowned. "Nobody would do that." Walter gave a sad smile. "Marcus Brooks would." Arthur glanced back at the wedding ring resting safely inside his coat pocket. The mystery was growing deeper by the day. Yet one fact was becoming impossible to ignore. Somewhere between the past and the present, something had gone terribly wrong. And if the pieces Walter was revealing were true, Angela Brooks had absolutely no idea what her late husband had sacrificed before he died. The next week passed like a slow-moving storm. Every morning, Angela woke up hoping something would change. Every night, she went to sleep carrying the same worries. The countdown hanging over the apartment now felt impossible to ignore. 9 days, then 8, then 7. The number kept shrinking no matter how hard she worked. One afternoon, she stopped by the mailbox on her way home from work. Most days it contained advertisements or unpaid bills. This day was no different. She sorted through the envelopes while climbing the stairs. Utility notice, credit card reminder, medical balance. By the time she reached her apartment door, her shoulders felt heavier than when she had left that morning. Inside, Ava sat at the kitchen table coloring pictures while Mason worked on a school project. "Look what I made," Ava said proudly. She held up a drawing of their family, standing in front of a large yellow house with flowers in the yard. Angela smiled. "That is beautiful. That is our future house," Ava explained confidently. "Mason says one day we will have one." Angela felt her throat tighten. The simple faith children carried seemed almost magical. Somehow they still believed good things were coming. She hoped they were right. That evening, after the children went to bed, Angela checked her bank account online. The balance staring back at her was lower than she expected. Her reduced work hours had already begun taking their toll. She carefully added up what remained. Even if she spent nothing extra, she was still hundreds of dollars short. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Quietly, briefly, just enough to release the pressure building inside her chest. Then she wiped her eyes and opened another job application. Across the state, Arthur Whitman sat inside a county records office reviewing documents spread across a long wooden table. Walter Henderson had pointed him towards several names connected to Marcus Brooks, and each conversation seemed to reveal another missing piece. One retired accountant remembered Marcus turning down an ownership offer years earlier. Another former employee remembered him helping struggling workers keep their jobs during difficult times. Everyone described the same man: honest, generous, reliable. Yet none of it explained why his family was now fighting to survive. Arthur leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Something was still missing. Then a clerk approached, carrying an old storage box from the archives. "This is everything we found under Brooks," she said. Arthur thanked her and opened the box. Most of the contents were ordinary business papers. Then he noticed a sealed envelope tucked beneath a stack of files. The handwriting on the front immediately caught his attention. It read, "To be opened only if necessary." Arthur carefully turned the envelope over. The seal remained intact despite the passing years. His pulse quickened. Whatever was inside had apparently never been read. At nearly the same moment, Angela received a phone call from her landlord. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, she sat silently on the edge of her bed, staring into space. The deadline had been moved forward. Instead of 7 days, she now had 5. 5 days before everything changed. 5 days before she might lose the only home her children had ever known. And hundreds of miles away, Arthur Whitman stared at the unopened envelope in his hands, unaware that the answer he had been searching for might finally be waiting inside. Arthur carried the sealed envelope back to his hotel room and placed it carefully on the desk. For several minutes, he simply stared at it. Decades had passed since someone had written those words across the front. To be opened only if necessary. Whatever Marcus Brooks had placed inside, he clearly intended it to remain hidden unless there was no other choice. Arthur finally broke the seal and unfolded the documents. Within, the first page appeared ordinary at first glance. Then he noticed the signatures. His eyes widened. He turned to the second page, then the third. By the time he finished reading, he sat back in stunned silence. The papers revealed something Marcus had never told anyone. Something that completely changed the story Arthur thought he understood. Meanwhile, Angela's world continued shrinking one day at a time. For days remained. She spent the morning visiting 3 businesses that had advertised job openings online. At the first location, the position had already been filled. At the second, they wanted availability she could not provide because of her children. At the third, she was told they would call if something opened in the future. By late afternoon, she sat inside her car staring at the steering wheel. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty. Her wallet contained less than $20. The numbers no longer made sense. She did not know how to stretch them any further. When she arrived home, she found Mason sitting on the apartment steps. "Why are you out here?" she asked. He looked down at his shoes. "I did not want Ava to hear me asking." Angela sat beside him. "Asking what?" Mason hesitated. "If we have to move, will I still go to the same school?" Angela felt her heart sink. Children always knew more than adults realized. She wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "Why would you ask that?" Mason shrugged. "I heard the landlord talking to somebody downstairs." For a moment, Angela could not speak. Then she forced a smile. "Right now, nothing is changing. Do you understand?" Mason nodded, but his expression said he was not convinced. Inside the apartment, Ava proudly showed them a gold star she had earned at school. She talked excitedly about a reading competition and a class party scheduled for the following month. Angela listened carefully, smiling at all the right moments. Yet a painful thought kept returning. What if they were not here next month? That night, after the children were asleep, Angela opened the kitchen drawer and removed the final warning notice. She stared at the deadline printed on the page. For days, then 3. Soon there would be nothing left to count. Hundreds of miles away, Arthur made another phone call. This time he contacted an attorney whose name appeared in Marcus's documents. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, Arthur stood by the hotel window looking out across the city lights. The mystery was finally beginning to make sense. Marcus Brooks had not merely sacrificed money years ago. He had sacrificed something far larger. Something that had quietly benefited other people while costing him everything. Arthur looked toward the wedding ring resting on the bedside table. For the first time since this journey began, he believed he knew exactly what he needed to do next. The only problem was time. Because while he was uncovering the truth, Angela Brooks was running out of it. 3 days remained. Angela did not need a calendar anymore. Every glance at the apartment walls reminded her. Every unopened bill. Every anxious thought. Every moment, she looked at Mason and Ava. The countdown seemed to follow her everywhere. On Wednesday morning, she woke before sunrise and quietly reviewed every possible option one last time. Borrowing money was impossible. Family members were struggling themselves. Friends had already helped when they could. Selling more belongings would barely make a difference. She sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at a notebook filled with calculations. No matter how many times she rearranged the numbers, they refused to work. Across the room, Ava wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mom," she asked softly, "why are you awake already?" Angela quickly closed the notebook. "Just planning some grown-up stuff." Ava climbed into her lap without another question. Children had a way of sensing sadness even when they did not understand it. She rested her head against Angela's shoulder and quietly held on. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Somehow that simple hug felt stronger than any advice. Later that afternoon, Angela received another disappointment. A local grocery store finally returned her application. The manager thanked her for applying, but explained that another candidate had accepted the position. Angela thanked him politely before ending the call. Then she sat in her car for nearly 10 minutes, staring through the windshield. She felt exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from trying everything and watching every door close. Meanwhile, Arthur Whitman spent the day meeting with attorneys, accountants, and two individuals connected to Marcus Brooks's past. Every conversation pointed in the same direction. The documents inside the sealed envelope had not simply contained personal records. They contained proof. Proof that Marcus had willingly surrendered a substantial ownership stake years earlier to protect a struggling company and hundreds of employees. While others built wealth from what followed, Marcus quietly stepped away. No lawsuits, no public recognition, no demand for repayment. He simply moved forward with his life. Arthur found himself increasingly disturbed by one question. If the company had eventually succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, why had nobody checked on Marcus's family after he passed away? Late that evening, Arthur finally received an answer. A retired executive named Leonard Graves agreed to meet him. Leonard listened carefully as Arthur explained what he had uncovered. The older man's face gradually lost color. "You are telling me Marcus's wife is struggling?" Leonard asked. Arthur nodded. Leonard looked away for several seconds. "Then we made a terrible mistake." Arthur leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Leonard opened an old folder he had carried to the meeting. Inside was a document Arthur had never seen before. As he read it, his eyes widened. Another piece of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Back at Cedar Grove Apartments, Angela tucked Mason and Ava into bed. Both children fell asleep quickly. She remained sitting beside them long afterward, watching them breathe peacefully. The apartment was quiet, safe, familiar. Yet she knew that within 72 hours, everything could change. As she stood to leave the room, Mason spoke without opening his eyes. "Mom." "Yes, baby. Everything is going to be okay." Angela froze. For a moment she could not answer. Then she gently kissed his forehead. "I hope so." Hundreds of miles away, Arthur Whitman carefully folded the newly discovered document and slipped it into his briefcase. Because for the first time since this journey began, he believed he finally knew exactly who owed Marcus Brooks's family a debt that should have been paid years ago. Ava woke up Thursday morning with a fever. At first, Angela hoped it was nothing serious. Children got sick sometimes. A little rest, plenty of water, and usually they bounced back within a day or two. But by lunchtime, Ava was lying on the couch wrapped in a blanket, her cheeks flushed and her energy completely gone. The little girl who normally filled the apartment with questions and laughter barely spoke above a whisper. Angela checked her temperature again and felt a knot form in her stomach. She reached for her phone and called the pediatric clinic. The receptionist was kind but direct. Ava needed to be examined. There would also be medication costs if treatment was required. After ending the call, Angela sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at the numbers in her bank account. The rent deadline was now only 2 days away. Every dollar mattered. Yet nothing mattered more than her daughter. The choice should have been simple. But poverty had a cruel way of turning obvious decisions into impossible ones. Later that afternoon, Mason sat beside his sister on the couch. He handed her his favorite blue blanket without saying a word. Ava managed a weak smile. "You do not have to share it." "Yes, I do," Mason replied. "It is the lucky blanket." Ava hugged it tightly. Watching them together nearly broke Angela's heart. These children had so little, yet they still found ways to take care of each other. That evening, Angela drove Ava to the clinic. The waiting room was crowded. Parents sat with tired expressions while children clutched stuffed animals and coloring books. After nearly an hour, the doctor finally examined Ava and assured Angela that she would recover with rest and medication. The relief was immediate. Then came the pharmacy bill. Angela stood at the counter, silently calculating what remained in her account. She paid anyway. There was never really another option. When they returned home, she placed the medicine on the kitchen counter and quietly moved money between accounts to prevent an overdraft fee. By the time she finished, almost nothing remained. Across the state, Arthur Whitman sat in a conference room with Leonard Graves and two other former executives. The atmosphere was tense. Documents covered the table. Financial statements, corporate records, signed agreements. Every page pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth. Marcus Brooks had voluntarily given up something worth far more than anyone realized at the time. The company that emerged afterward had gone on to generate enormous success. Yet the family of the man who helped make it possible had been forgotten. Leonard finally removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. How did we let this happen? Nobody answered. Because nobody had a good answer. Arthur reached into his briefcase and removed the wedding ring. The room fell silent. Leonard stared at it for several seconds before speaking. That ring should never have ended up in a pawn shop. Arthur nodded slowly. Then perhaps it is time to make things right. Back at the apartment, Angela tucked Ava into bed and sat beside her until she fell asleep. The medicine had helped, but the little girl still looked exhausted. Angela brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead and glanced toward the calendar hanging on the wall. 2 days remained. 2 days before the deadline arrived, and she had never felt further away from a solution. 1 day remained. Angela did not need reminders anymore. The deadline seemed written across every surface of the apartment. She saw it in the kitchen sink while washing dishes. She saw it in the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. She saw it every time she looked at Mason and Ava. Friday arrived gray and cold, matching the weight she carried inside. Ava was feeling better, but the medication and clinic visit had drained nearly everything Angela had left. That morning she checked her bank balance again. The number staring back at her was so small it barely felt real. She closed the application before the children could notice. "Are we having pancakes tomorrow?" Ava asked while putting on her shoes for school. It had become their Saturday tradition whenever they could afford it. Angela forced a smile. "We will see what we can do." Ava grinned and hurried toward the door. Mason lingered behind. He studied his mother for a moment before speaking. "You do not have to pretend around me." Angela froze. "Pretend about what?" "That everything is okay." The words were gentle, not accusatory. Somehow that made them harder to hear. Angela pulled him into a hug. "I am trying my best." Mason nodded. "I know." After the children left, Angela spent the day making phone calls. Every possibility, every contact, every lead she could think of. Some numbers went unanswered. Others ended politely, but without help. By late afternoon, she sat in her car outside a shopping center staring at her phone. The screen reflected a tired woman she barely recognized. For the first time since Marcus passed away, she felt completely out of options. Across the state, Arthur Whitman finally assembled all the missing pieces. The documents, the testimonies, the financial records, the forgotten agreements. Everything now pointed to the same conclusion. Marcus Brooks had helped create the foundation for a company that eventually grew far beyond anyone's expectations. Years earlier, when the business faced collapse, Marcus had made a decision that protected hundreds of workers and saved the company itself. In exchange, he walked away from wealth that could have transformed his family's future. The people who benefited never intentionally abandoned his family. Instead, over time, leadership changed. Records disappeared. Memories faded. The debt simply slipped through the cracks of history. Until now, Arthur sat across from Leonard Graves and several former executives in a private conference room. Nobody spoke for several moments. Finally, Leonard broke the silence. "How much time does she have?" Arthur looked down at the calendar on his phone. "Less than 24 hours. The room fell silent again. Leonard slowly nodded. "Then we do not have 24 hours to waste." That evening, Angela returned home carrying a single grocery bag. Bread, soup, a few essentials, nothing more. The children ate dinner while talking about school. Ava laughed for the first time in days. Mason shared a story about a class project. Angela listened carefully, memorizing the moment without fully understanding why. Perhaps because part of her feared it might be one of their last evenings in this apartment. Later, After the children fell asleep, she sat alone in the dark living room. The final notice rested on the coffee table. Tomorrow was the deadline. Tomorrow, everything would come due. And nearly 300 miles away, a convoy of vehicles quietly pulled onto the highway before dawn, heading directly towards Cedar Grove Apartments. Saturday morning arrived far too quickly. Angela barely slept. Every hour she checked the clock. Every sound outside the apartment pulled her awake. By sunrise, she was already sitting at the kitchen table staring at the final notice. The deadline had officially arrived. For several minutes, she simply sat there in silence while the apartment remained still around her. Then she heard small footsteps. Ava wandered into the kitchen wearing pajamas and carrying her stuffed rabbit. "Are we making pancakes?" she asked hopefully. Angela forced a smile despite the ache in her chest. "Not today, sweetheart." Ava looked disappointed for only a second before climbing into a chair beside her. Children adapted to disappointment far more often than they should. A few minutes later, Mason joined them. The three shared a simple breakfast of toast and cereal. Nobody mentioned the deadline. Nobody mentioned the rent. For a brief moment, the apartment almost felt normal again. Then came the knock at the door. Angela froze instantly. She knew exactly what it meant. Her stomach tightened as she slowly stood. Mason and Ava looked up from the table. The knock came again. 3 firm taps. Professional. Official. Angela walked toward the door while trying to keep her expression calm. She opened it and found the property manager standing outside holding a folder. His face looked uncomfortable. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "may I come in for a moment?" Angela already knew the conversation before it started. She stepped aside and allowed him inside. The children remained at the kitchen table watching nervously. The manager lowered his voice. "I am sorry. I truly am. But unless payment is received today, the process moves forward." Angela nodded slowly. She appreciated his kindness, but kindness could not change numbers. "I understand." The manager hesitated. "You have been a good tenant." Angela managed a faint smile. "That does not change what I owe." After he left, silence filled the apartment. Mason stared at the floor. Ava hugged her rabbit tighter. Finally, the little girl asked the question Angela had been dreading. "Are we losing our home?" Angela knelt beside her children. Every instinct told her to promise everything would be fine. Yet she could no longer make promises she was not sure she could keep. "I am doing everything I can," she said softly. Mason nodded as though he had expected that answer. Ava's eyes filled with tears. Angela pulled both children into her arms and held them tightly. Across 300 miles of highway, a line of vehicles continued moving steadily towards Cedar Grove Apartments. Arthur Whitman sat in the lead vehicle beside Leonard Graves. Behind them traveled attorneys, executives, and several individuals connected to the company Marcus Brooks had helped save years ago. Nobody spoke much during the drive. The gravity of what they were about to do hung heavily in the air. Leonard finally broke the silence. "Do you think she knows?" Arthur shook his head. "Not even a little." Back at the apartment, Angela opened her laptop one final time. She searched for emergency housing options, temporary shelters, assistance programs, anything that might help if the worst happened. The results blurred together as tears filled her eyes. She quickly wiped them away before the children could notice. Outside, clouds gathered overhead. Inside, hope felt dangerously fragile. And just as Angela began accepting that she had reached the end of every possible option, a convoy of unfamiliar vehicles turned into the entrance of Cedar Grove Apartments. Angela noticed the vehicles through the living room window before she heard the knock. One after another, dark sedans and SUVs pulled into the parking lot and came to a stop. Residents stepped onto balconies. Curtains shifted. Curious faces appeared at windows throughout the building. Cedar Grove Apartments had never seen anything like it. Angela's first thought was that there had been some kind of mistake. Her second thought was that perhaps the landlord had brought legal representatives. Neither possibility made her feel any better. Then came another knock at the door. Calm, deliberate, nothing like the earlier visit. Angela took a deep breath and opened it. Standing in the hallway was Arthur Whitman. For a second, she did not recognize him. Then she remembered the pawn shop, the wedding ring, the $12. Behind him stood several men and women dressed in business attire. One elderly man stepped forward, his eyes already filled with emotion. "Mrs. Brooks?" he asked softly. Angela nodded cautiously. "My name is Leonard Graves." The name meant nothing to her. "May we come in?" Angela hesitated before stepping aside. Within moments, the small apartment felt crowded. Mason and Ava moved closer to their mother. Arthur noticed immediately and offered them a reassuring smile. Nobody sat down right away. The room was too tense. Finally, Leonard looked around the apartment and took a slow breath. "There is no easy way to say this," he began. "So, I am simply going to tell you the truth." Angela folded her arms. "What truth?" Leonard glanced toward Arthur before continuing. "Your husband helped save a company many years ago." Angela frowned. Marcus worked for a lot of companies. This one was different. Leonard removed a folder from his briefcase and handed it to her. Inside were photographs, legal documents, newspaper articles, and signed agreements. Angela slowly turned the pages. The further she read, the more confused she became. Then she stopped. One document carried Marcus's signature. Another showed ownership percentages. Another showed transfers. Her eyes widened. "I do not understand." Leonard's voice trembled slightly. Marcus could have become extremely wealthy. Silence filled the apartment. Angela stared at him. "That is impossible." "No," Arthur said quietly. "It is." "True." Leonard nodded. When the company faced collapse, Marcus gave up something that would have made him rich. He did it to protect employees and their families. Hundreds of jobs were saved because of him. Angela looked down at the documents again. Her hands were shaking now. "He never told me any of this." "That sounds exactly like Marcus," Leonard replied. Tears appeared in his eyes. He never wanted recognition. Arthur then reached into a small case and carefully removed the wedding ring. The room fell silent. He placed it gently in Angela's hand. "This belongs with your family." Angela stared at the ring as tears filled her eyes. Ava looked up at her mother. "Is that Daddy's ring?" Angela could only nod. Leonard stepped forward one final time. "Mrs. Brooks, we discovered something else." He opened another folder. "There is a debt that should have been paid years ago. A very large debt. And today, we intend to make it right." For several seconds, nobody in the apartment spoke. Angela stared at the folder in her hands while Mason and Ava stood beside her. The wedding ring rested against her palm, warm from her grip. It felt impossible that the same ring she had surrendered for $12 was now sitting at the center of a story she never knew existed. Leonard Graves slowly opened the final folder and placed several documents on the kitchen table. "Marcus never asked for recognition," he said. "He never asked for repayment. But that does not erase what he did." Angela looked down at the paperwork. One page showed figures she could barely comprehend. Another detailed agreements that had remained buried in company archives for years. Leonard pointed to a signature. When Marcus gave up his ownership stake, he protected hundreds of families. The company survived because of that decision. Over time, that company grew beyond anyone's expectations. Arthur Whitman stood quietly nearby, allowing the moment to unfold. Leonard took a slow breath. "After reviewing everything, our board voted unanimously." He slid one final document toward her. "We established a compensation package recognizing Marcus's contribution and the debt owed to his family." Angela scanned the page. Then she stopped. Her eyes widened. She read the number again because her mind refused to accept it the first time. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "This cannot be real," she whispered. Leonard smiled gently. "It is very real." The amount would eliminate every debt she carried. It would secure housing. It would provide educational funds for Mason and Ava. It would create stability her family had not experienced in years. Ava looked up at her mother. "Are we okay now?" Angela could not answer immediately. She pulled both children into her arms and held them tightly. This time the tears came freely. Not from fear. Not from exhaustion. From relief. Months of worry seemed to leave her body all at once. Mason wrapped his arms around her. Ava squeezed the stuffed rabbit between them. Across the room, several of the former executives quietly wiped their eyes. They had come expecting to correct a mistake. They had not expected to witness the human cost of that mistake. Before leaving, Arthur stepped forward one last time. "There is something else." He nodded toward the ring. "Keep it where it belongs." Angela looked down at the gold band. For the first time since Marcus passed away, she felt as though a piece of him had returned home. 3 months later, life looked very different. Mason was preparing for his school field trip. Ava was planning her reading competition. The family had moved into a comfortable home with a small yard exactly like the one Ava had drawn months earlier. One evening, Angela stood on the back porch watching her children play while the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. The wedding ring rested safely on a chain around her neck. She touched it gently and smiled. Marcus had never become wealthy. He had never sought applause. He had simply chosen to help others when it mattered most. Years later, that kindness had found its way back home. And as Angela listened to the sound of her children laughing in the yard, she finally understood something Marcus had known all along. The greatest things we leave behind are not the things we keep. They are the lives we change.